So now we're going to do a simple example of trade, in particular showing the benefits of trade between two people, or it could be two countries. And I'm showing it with PPFs, although you don't really actually need to use a PPF to do these examples. So you might be given two different people, and again we have each producing good A and good B. And for these examples we're going to use straight line constant opportunity cost just to make it a little simpler so that opportunity cost isn't changing along the whole curve. It's staying the same no matter where we produce. So that just makes it a little simpler. So this is just in case you can't see the numbers here. So we have 10 over here and 20 over here. 10A, 20B is for person 1, and we have 8 and 8 over here for person 2. And so you might sometimes see it as just put it on the same axes, so then you can clearly see that person 1 is out here and person 2 is over here. And you can tell they have different opportunity costs because the slopes of these curves are different. Or you might not even be given the curves. You could just be given a table that says, for a given amount of resources, person 1 can produce 10A or 20B, and same amount of resources, 2 can produce 8 and 8, and so you wouldn't even really need the PPS for this. But we can illustrate kind of before and after by just looking at the graphs. So we have this concept of absolute advantage, and what that means is for a given amount of resources, and we're holding resources the same here, so this could be each person with 1 day's worth of time or whatever resources we're looking at, this is how much they can produce. So we're comparing between these two people for a given amount of resources, and whoever can produce more output for a particular good with a given amount of resources, they have the absolute advantage in that good. So for a given amount of resources, person 1 can produce 10 units of A, person 2 can only produce 8, which means person 1 has an absolute advantage in A. And in this case, they also have an absolute advantage in B. They can produce 20 with a given amount of resources, and person 2 can only produce 8. So in this case, person 1 has an absolute advantage in both goods. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because suppose I had this curve going from here to here, let's say, well then person 1 would have an absolute advantage in one, person 2 would have the absolute advantage in the other. In this case, I wanted to make it so that one person had the absolute advantage in both, because what we're going to show is, even though in this sense person 1 is better at producing both things, there's still going to be a reason for this person to trade with the other person, and both of them will be better off by trade. So it's a good example to show the benefits of trade. So then what we want to do is get our opportunity costs. So notice that absolute advantage is not based on opportunity cost in terms of one good versus the other. So remember, there's only two goods here, so the opportunity cost of producing A is how much B you're giving up, and vice versa. So now we want to get it in terms of opportunity cost, which is again, the slope of this curve. So the way I always tell my students to set this up in a very particular way to avoid mistakes. Because we have ratios between these two goods. If you do it this way, you're never going to mix up the ratios, because you don't know if I should take A divided by B or B divided by A. This way you're never going to mess this up. So that's why, like I said before, we're just going to look at these endpoints, or if I was just given a table, I would just use the numbers that they were giving me. So they would just tell me, I can produce 10 units of A or 20 units of B. So instead of trying to figure out right away which ratio, how to set up the ratio, if you set it up like this, you're just solving a simple equation. So I'm just going to say, okay, if I take those 10 units of A and then switch all of my resources over to B, I get 20 units of B, so that's the ratio, 10 units of A to 20 units of B, and I'm going to set it up like an equation, although this is just the ratio of opportunity cost of one versus the other. So once I get this, 10A for every 20B, or 20B for every 10A, and then I want to get it in terms of 1 unit. So all you're doing is treating this like an equation that you're just going to solve, very simple equation. So what this is for every unit of A that I produce, I'm giving up 2B, or for every 2B that I produce, I'm giving up 1A. And then all I'm going to do is just get it in terms of 1A, and then I also want it in terms of 1B, so I'll have all these numbers in front of me. So I'm just kind of flipping this is just reciprocal of that, or I'm just solving this for B. So if it's 1A for 2B, it's 1B for half an A. right? So these are the numbers I want: the opportunity cost of producing A in terms of B, the opportunity cost of B in terms of A. So if I do it that way, I'm never gonna mess up which one, because I'm always going to divide one divided by the other. So I'm not going to mess up which one I'm dividing by the other one, because either it's going to be 10 over 20 or 20 over 10. If I do it this way, I'm never going to mess up that ratio. So I'm going to do the same thing for over. So even though these numbers are obviously very simple, I can see right away it's going to be 1 to 1. But I'm still going to set it up because I want these numbers in front of me when I solve this problem. When I figure out what's going to be going on here. So I'm still going to rewrite it. Let's get 1A in terms of one, all on one side. I want it in terms of 1 unit. So it's 1A to 1B, obviously 1B to 1A. So I want these 4 values here in front of me, even though, obviously this is very easy to figure out. So once I have that, that's really the information that I need. What are my opportunity costs for each person, for each good? Once I have that, I'm just basically reading off the answer. Because now what's going to be relevant for trade is what's the difference between our opportunity costs. So when person 1 produces A, what are they actually giving up? They're giving up a certain amount of B and vice versa. So that's what's going to be relevant for trade. So first we're going to figure out who has the lowest opportunity cost of producing A. So I'm looking at what's his opportunity cost of producing A, what's his opportunity cost of producing A. As long as their ratios are different, one's going to be lower. That's what we call a comparative advantage. So remember, absolute advantage, person 1 had the absolute advantage in both things. But because their opportunity costs are different, he's not going to have the comparative advantage in both things. So person 2, even though he had the absolute disadvantage in both, when you look at the ratios, what is he giving up? He's giving up less of B than person 1 would when they produce A. Right? So in terms of B, person 2 is able to produce it at a lower opportunity cost. So in other words, person 1 is, in terms of resources, person 1 is better at everything, but they're going to be relatively better at one of them. So as long as that's so, in other words, because they're so much better at producing B, that means that they have a comparative disadvantage in producing A, which means that person 2 is going to have the comparative advantage in producing A. So as long as there's some difference in how much you're better at one thing versus the other, that means you're going to have a comparative advantage in one thing, a comparative disadvantage in the other thing. So in other words, when we want to trade with each other, it's going to be better for person 1 to spend their time producing B because they're so much better, relatively speaking, at producing B. They're going to want to produce more B and trade some of it. Let the other guy produce A where their opportunity cost is lower. Right? So even though, again, he has the absolute disadvantage in producing both, he's going to have the comparative advantage in producing A because he's giving up less of the other good if he were to specialize in producing A.